What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 10 strange and mysterious finds in Jamestown, Virginia. Jamestown, Virginia, is the site of the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Established in 1607, the colony was initially the creation of a corporation called the Virginia Company of London. One could buy shares in the new venture or travel to the area themselves. The Jamestown settlement struggled during its first 2 decades. The earliest residents endured a starving time that decimated the small population, and they experienced other challenging circumstances. Bad press about living conditions and life expectancy traveled back to England, and for a time it was difficult to convince people to settle in the new colony. However, things had settled down in Jamestown by the 1630s. A number of royal supporters were expelled during the English Civil War, and some of them settled in Virginia. The original settlement was essentially abandoned by the late 17th century, and for 200 years, Jamestown was largely forgotten. Many experts even insisted that the original James Fort had washed away into the James River, and like the mysterious Roanoke colony, it was considered lost to history. At the beginning of the 1990s, historian and archaeologist Bill Kelso insisted that the original location, where Captain John Smith and Pocahontas walked, remained unchanged. Kelso got it right. Since 1994, Preservation Virginia and Jamestown Rediscovery have carefully excavated the site marking the storied colony of Virginia. What they found is as strange as it is amazing. A skull that may have been cannibalized. A skull and a severed leg bone were found buried in an early 17th century kitchen cellar during a 2012 Jamestown Rediscovery Preservation Virginia archaeological dig. Visible cut marks on the skull and the bone, as if to remove the flesh for consumption, suggest cannibalistic activity. Why would the supposedly moral settlers of Jamestown turn to eating human flesh? The discovered bones were determined to come from a terrible time during the very earliest years of the colony. This starving time decreased the population from around 500 to 60 in less than 1 year. Some settlers were lost to disease, but most perished from lack of food. Accounts written by survivors and acquaintances reported that the colonists resorted to cannibalism after all other food sources were exhausted. Jane was the name given to the discovered skull by Jamestown archaeologists and scientists from the Smithsonian Institute. They found that the skull and leg bone belonged to a woman who was around 14 years old. They aren't sure whether she was butchered to serve as food or if she perished and was then consumed. An intriguing contemporary account may or may not solve the mystery of Jane. According to letters written to the Virginia Company, the corporation that created the Jamestown colony, the desperate settlers ate any animals they could find, even rats and snakes. They finally resorted to digging up recently buried corpses and eating those. But one man among the colonists might have had a different approach to circumvent the lack of food. He is said to have butchered and powdered salted his pregnant wife. Some accounts provide the particularly gruesome detail of how he cut the baby out and threw it into the James River. His stash of wife meat was eventually revealed, only her head was missing. Could Jane be the unfortunate woman? Historians will likely never know for certain. A child's shoes, believe it or not, even a few shoes survived the centuries buried in Jamestown pits and wells. Unearthed discoveries included a children's worn pair of shoes, constructed of goatskin leather. The condition of the shoes suggests only light wear. Perhaps a young child took his or her first steps in the new world in these very shoes. Shoes were a mark of prestige, particularly for children, who typically went barefoot. So, the shoes either belonged to a child of a wealthy Jamestown family or a child of lesser status whose parents doted upon them. A Shakespearean connection signet ring at Jamestown. In addition to the bones, glass, and pottery that were found there, additional valuable items have been found. One of the most intriguing is a brass signet ring, embossed with the image of an eagle with spread wings. The symbol was associated with the Strachey family of England. William Strachey was an early Jamestown colonist. He was an educated man and a playwright who moved within William Shakespeare's literary circle. He was also among the passengers of a ship destined for Jamestown, thought lost just prior to the starving time. But Strachey's ship, the Sea Venture, wasn't lost. Instead, it got caught in a hurricane and blown off course. The ship landed, somewhat damaged, on Bermuda. The crew and passengers were stuck there all winter until they could repair the ship. They loaded the hold and set sail for Jamestown when spring arrived. When the repaired Sea Venture reached Jamestown Island, the new arrivals discovered a small group of weak and emaciated settlers, a total of 60. The other ships which had come over with the Sea Venture had made it to Jamestown, swelling the population to around 500. However, the Sea Venture had brought firearms and other hunting or fort defense-related supplies, as well as the food, seeds, and farming implements. The settlement had struggled without them. The survivors begged the leadership from the Sea Venture to take them away from their horrible existence at James Fort, and it was decided that everyone would board the ship and return to England immediately. But as they were making their way down the James River and into the Chesapeake Bay, a group of ships was spied, carrying new colonists and fresh supplies. Everyone agreed to return and give Jamestown one more try. When Strachey finally returned to England, he was known to regale his fellow poets and authors with stories from his adventures in Bermuda and Virginia. Shakespeare supposedly based his play The Tempest on the tale of the shipwrecked Sea Venture. As for Strachey's ring, it's unclear whether he lost it during the 1 year he spent at Jamestown, or if he sold it and someone else lost it. A knight's tomb. An elaborate grave covering that appears to have belonged to a knight was discovered by the crew at the Jamestown site, which uncovered an object that appeared out of place. Either someone wanted a special memorial for a family member, or an actual knight settled in Virginia during the 17th century. Who might this enigmatic knight be? Lord de la Warr, an early colonial governor, held a title, but there is little evidence to suggest he is the knight. Then there was Sir George Yardley, who some historians believe is the strongest candidate for ownership of the knight's tomb of Jamestown. Yardley served as governor and returned to England for a time to secure his knighthood. Historians have studied letters and records of Yardley's heirs for clues. One letter written by Yardley's step-grandson mentions that the family would like to order a large, black marble tomb with the crest of Sir George Yardley embossed on the cover. That suggests a possible connection with the knight's tomb, though the crest is missing. Even though Yardley appears to fit the description of the mysterious knight, the case probably will never be solved. For one thing, there is no way to determine the original site of the tomb. The stone was moved to serve as a paver in the aisle of the memorial church that was built at Jamestown in the early 20th century. It's also unclear whether any remains buried beneath its current location belonged to the original body. The remains of a teenage settler and the arrowhead that ended him. At Jamestown, archaeologists found the remains of a 14 or 15-year-old boy. The teen had a Native American arrowhead buried in the bone of his left leg, suggesting he was cut down in a fight. Although skirmishes and battles with the Powhatan people were not uncommon, this burial took place very soon after the first colonists arrived, in 1607. The boy also appears to have been hastily buried, due to the position of his body and the fact that the dirt covering him was completely lacking in any European artifacts. Some historians believe he was the colony's first fatality. Captain Gabriel Archer and Captain John Smith both wrote about an incident that took place just 2 weeks after they arrived and established Jamestown. A young man had been killed in a fight with the Powhatans, the men said. According to the Wisconsin Historical Society's American Journeys collection, Captain Smith noted, "The Native Americans had entered the fort with our own men, which were then busied in setting corn, in which conflict most of the council was hurt, a boy slain." Catholic reliquary. Jamestown archaeologists discovered a burial site containing the graves of 4 early and prominent colonists. Gabriel Archer, a young man who had arrived on the first voyage to Virginia and had a fierce rivalry with Captain John Smith, was buried in one of these graves. For 400 years, it was presumed that all colony leaders were devout Protestant Christians. And yet, Archer's grave contained a small Catholic reliquary, a container holding objects of religious significance. Scientists were able to figure out that the box even contained bone shards thanks to CT scan technology. Jamestown was established in 1607 as an English colony in Virginia. England was by then a firmly Protestant Christian country after years of religious wars, and the Protestant James I was on the throne. Spain, however, was still very Catholic and establishing their claim in the New World. English leaders felt compelled to achieve their own Protestant foothold across the Atlantic. They believed that if they did not, then the entire New World would be Catholic. England was in no way interested in returning to the wars of religion. Politics aside, plenty of closeted papists still existed in 1607. Considering that, it's less surprising to find a Catholic reliquary buried with an early Jamestown colonist. Still, it was exciting to find the object with the Protestant archer. Jamestown archaeologists have discovered a variety of other Catholic items as well, including rosary beads and crucifixes. Historians assumed that those items were merely the result of trading with Spaniards passing through the settlement, but the discovery of the reliquary is leading them to reconsider religious life in Jamestown. Double graves. According to early records from the Virginia Company, the first colonists in 1607 were tasked with making sure that the native people did not know about any sickness or death at the fort. So, as the first settlers began to pass from the Powhatans or illness, a graveyard was created within Fort James. Although Europeans did not typically live close to graves, the Virginia Company's instructions were followed. John Smith recorded that 50 colonists died in the new graveyard alone between May and September of 1607. As archaeologists began excavating these burial grounds, they quickly discovered that some of these graves contained more than one person's remains. No one knows for certain why two bodies were placed together that way, though it may well have to do with saving time digging graves and conserving space within the fort. A German brass counterweight. 17th century Jamestown was far more cosmopolitan than many assume. Polish glassblowers were brought over in the first decade of the colony to establish a much-needed glass industry. Despite the hard feelings between their two countries, English settlers regularly interacted with Spanish settlers. And some Jamestown colonists were already world travelers, as demonstrated by the items unearthed by archaeological digs. Some of the pieces experts have found hail from places other than England. Take for instance this brass counterweight made in Germany. The weight in the shape of a lion was found in a dig that was more associated with the Civil War than with early Jamestown. However, it was found in the early 17th century. It was manufactured in Nuremberg and weighs just under 2 ounces. The counterweight was designed to assist in proper measurement when using a balance scale. A lead-riddled body in a military sash. 4 early Jamestown graves were discovered in the original church site's chancel, which was one of the most sacred areas in the church. Archaeologists knew that the location indicated the high status of those buried in the graves. DNA testing and examination of the accompanying artifacts allowed researchers and scientists to identify the remains. Captain William West was one of the 4 prominent colonists buried in the church chancel. He was only 24 when he perished during a 1610 skirmish with the Powhatan. He was discovered wearing the remains of an ornate, fringed military sash, which researchers concluded was probably silk and was decorated with silver fringe and spangles. West's remains also contain high levels of lead. Wealthy people of the 16th and 17th centuries used dishes and vessels made from silver and pewter, which were known to contain lead. The other 3 men buried alongside West include Captain Gabriel Archer, Reverend Robert Hunt, and Sir Ferdinando Wainman. A trumpet mouthpiece. A trumpet mouthpiece was discovered beneath the earth of Jamestown. It could have come from Germany's Nuremberg, where most 17th century trumpets were made. No known English-made trumpet from the period exists. The Jamestown trumpet may be the earliest trumpet discovered in America, regardless of its origin. Trumpets have always been an integral part of fort society, and James Fort was no different. Additionally, they were used to announce the arrival of the colonists at Native American camps. Chief Powhatan was warned in a letter by an early colonial governor named Thomas Dale that the colony's leaders would announce the beginning of a conflict with our drums and trumpets if he did not return runaway colonists or stolen items from Fort James. In the shadowy marshlands of Virginia, Where the humid air seems thick with secrets and history lurks just beneath the soil, the long-forgotten bones of America's first permanent English colony began to whisper again in the 1990s, thanks to a stubborn archaeologist named Bill Kelso, who refused to believe that the heart of Jamestown had been swallowed by the James River. A ghost town of eerie relics, human remains, and puzzling artifacts buried beneath centuries of mud and myth was what he discovered instead, which was infinitely more bizarre. The discoveries, slowly pulled from the earth like riddles in a dark fairy tale, paint a much more unsettling picture of early colonial life than what's found in your average school textbook. These weren't simply pious pioneers building a brave new world. They were desperate survivors, aristocrats hiding secrets, men dying violently, and women vanishing into the pages of history, some reduced to bones with knife marks. The more items that Kelso's team found, the more disturbing the story became. Together, they reveal a colony that is on the verge of madness and expose Jamestown's polished exterior. One such item was the infamous skull of a teenage girl, later nicknamed Jane, discovered in 2012 during an excavation of what had once been a cellar kitchen. The bones were not remarkable at first glance, until the forensic team noticed the unmistakable evidence of deliberate incisions, clear signs that someone had tried to remove flesh from the skull and leg bones. Jane, estimated to be about 14 years old, had been carved up like meat. She was, as scientists grimly confirmed, a victim of cannibalism. Her mutilated remains served as a reminder of the starving time in 1609 to 1610, when a famine reduced the colonists' population from 500 to just 60 and forced them to eat dogs, rats, snakes, and eventually each other. There were rumors even then of one man who butchered his pregnant wife, salted her flesh, and tossed their unborn child into the river. Jane's skull suggests that the horror stories weren't just colonial folklore. And while no one can confirm whether Jane was that particular wife or another nameless victim of culinary necessity, the grim reality is inescapable. Jamestown wasn't just a settlement. It was a nightmare dressed in buckled shoes and Protestant prayers. A pair of tiny shoes made of goatskin was buried nearby, which was another startling find. Despite being worn out, faded, and softly breaking apart at the seams, they retained their shape and the memory of the child who once wore them. These were not the rough sandals that a peasant child would make by hand. They were refined, carefully stitched, and showed only the lightest wear, suggesting the child may not have walked much at all. Perhaps they were new to the colony, or perhaps they were a cherished possession tucked away by grieving parents after a child perished in the harsh new world. Shoes back then were a luxury, especially for children, who typically went barefoot unless their parents were wealthy or unusually doting. And so the shoes pose a haunting question. Who was this child, and why were their pristine shoes discarded or buried in a trash pit near a well? The answer remains as unknowable as the child's fate. Just a few feet away, archaeologists unearthed something even more confounding. A brass signet ring, inscribed with the emblem of a soaring eagle, an image linked to the Strachey family of England. That family name triggered a flurry of excitement among historians because it could potentially tie the ring to William Strachey, a playwright, colonist, and friend of William Shakespeare. Strachey, who sailed aboard the ill-fated Sea Venture, was shipwrecked in Bermuda for months, only to arrive at Jamestown and find a population that had nearly starved itself to extinction. Strachey's vivid accounts of the storm, the shipwreck, and the madness of the colony's survivors were circulated back in England, and some scholars even suspect that Shakespeare used Strachey's writings as inspiration for The Tempest. Did Strachey lose the ring during his brief stay in the doomed colony? Or did he sell or gift it to another colonist, who later lost it in the mud? The last person who wore the ring, whose story died in the dirt centuries ago, holds the key to the truth. But while the ring suggests literary connections and aristocratic visitors, the team also stumbled upon the remnants of something more medieval. A knight's tomb. Found in pieces, the grave covering had been repurposed as a stone paver in the aisle of the 1907 Memorial Church. But the design and craftsmanship hinted at something older, perhaps 17th-century English stonework meant for a man of noble status. Historians speculated wildly. Could this be the final resting place of Sir George Yardley, one-time governor of Virginia and a knight of the realm? His descendants once mentioned ordering an elaborate tomb, topped with black marble and engraved with a family crest. But the tombstone found at Jamestown had no such crest, and worse still, there's no evidence it remained in its original burial site. So who was this knight, buried with honors in a colony plagued by starvation and failure? Was he real, or was the tomb just a status symbol created by colonists trying to cling to the last shreds of English nobility in the sweltering backwater of the New World? Then there was the teenage settler, just 14 or 15 years old, found buried with a Native American arrowhead lodged in his knee. His remains were slumped awkwardly in a shallow grave, clearly buried in haste, and notably without the usual colonial artifacts like buttons or shroud pins. He may have been the first to die at Jamestown. Contemporary reports from John Smith and Gabriel Archer describe a boy killed by Powhatan warriors within 2 weeks of their arrival in 1607. Could these bones be his? Archaeologists believe so. The arrowhead remains firmly embedded in his bone, a relic of the deadly collision between European ambition and indigenous resistance. And yet, he's still more known than others. For every settler whose fate is partially reconstructed, there are dozens whose bones whisper nothing. Take, for example, the grave of a man buried with his arms crossed, possibly in a Christian pose of repose, or possibly bound. A copper jeton, or coin-like token used for accounting, was found near his skull. Jetons were often used for trade or teaching mathematics in the early 17th century, and their presence in a grave is highly unusual. Does it identify the man as an accountant or trader, or was it intended as a spiritual offering? Or was it a sign of remorse? Historians have long suspected that some graves in Jamestown may have belonged to executed criminals, men hanged or shot for theft, murder, or mutiny during the chaos of the starving time. The identity of the man remains unknown, but the symbolism of the jeton continues to spark debate.